The distress signal came from Verath 7, a frontier outpost so far from the galactic core that most conquered maps still labeled it as uncharted. It arrived in fragmented bursts, half-burned transmissions that sensor operators initially mistook for background radiation. But Scout Commander Relkaz of the Dominari fleet had spent 30 years reading signals, and something in those broken pulses made the fur along his spine rise. He ordered his bridge crew to enhance and reconstruct. What emerged from the static was not a cry for help, it was a warning. All vessels, this is Verath Station. Do not approach the anomaly. Repeat, do not approach. It is not a derelict. It is not dead. We made that mistake. Do not. The transmission ended there. Relkaz sat in his command chair for a long moment, the silence of his bridge pressing against him like deep water. Around him, 22 officers stared at their consoles, waiting. He was the kind of commander who never showed fear. He was, at this moment, afraid. He ordered the fleet to advance. Verath 7 came into sensor range 6 hours later, and the first thing Relkaz noticed was what was missing. The Verath asteroid belt, a dense, churning ring of rock and iron that had made the system notoriously difficult to navigate, had been partially cleared. Not by collision, not by natural drift, cleared deliberately with geometric precision as though something enormous had needed room to stop. The second thing he noticed was the marathon. His senior analyst, a young Dominari female named Vesa, read the initial scan results aloud, her voice climbing half an octave with each line. Object is approximately 41 kilometers in length, width at midpoint 9 kilometers. Mass signature is, she paused, recalibrated, paused again. Commander, the mass signature is consistent with a small Class 4 moon. Nobody spoke. Relkaz leaned forward in his chair and studied the visual feed. The marathon hung against the stars like a continent that had decided to go for a walk. Its hull was the color of deep iron, not the polished silver of Dominari warships, not the elegant white ceramic of Velhari cruisers, but the dark, scarred, unhurried gray of something that had been built to last and knew it. Running lights traced its spine in dim amber. Its engines were cold. Its weapons were, as far as their sensors could tell, retracted. It looked, for all the world, like a sleeping animal. Any response to our hails? Relkaz asked. None, sir. Life signs. Vesa hesitated. Approximately 43,000, sir. The bridge went very quiet. 43,000. A Dominari warship of the first class carried 800 crew. Even their largest orbital platforms, decade-long construction projects, pride of the fleet, housed no more than 12,000. Whatever this vessel was, it did not carry a crew. It carried a population. Embedded with the fleet as a diplomatic observer, Suan of the Velhari stood at the rear of the bridge, her four-fingered hands folded behind her back, her large, pale eyes fixed on the visual feed. She was one of the Conquered's finest diplomatic minds, assigned to this mission as a formality. Nobody had expected anything more interesting than a malfunctioning relay station. Now she quietly opened her personal recorder and began documenting. She wrote, "The vessel does not broadcast, it does not maneuver, it does not respond. It simply exists with the confidence of something that has never needed to announce itself." Relkaz ordered close approach. His fleet, 400 warships, the finest the Dominari Empire had ever assembled, began to tighten around the marathon in a formation designed to overwhelm anything in the known galaxy. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if some instinct, ancient, wordless mammalian, was warning them all to step carefully around something sleeping. At 300 kilometers distance, the marathon's running lights changed. The amber along its spine shifted, slowly, without urgency, to a steady, unwavering white. Vesa looked up from her console, her voice barely above a whisper. "Commander, I think it sees us." Relkaz stared at the massive ship on the view screen. In 40 years of military service, he had faced down dreadnoughts, survived supernovae, negotiated with species that communicated through pain. He had never, not once, felt what he felt in that moment. Small. He felt very, very small. He straightened in his chair, smoothed his uniform, and ordered the comm channel opened. "Unidentified vessel," he said, his voice carrying every gram of authority he had spent a lifetime building. "You are surrounded by the Dominari war host. Identify yourself and state your intentions." The channel hummed with static. Then, from 43,000 lives packed into 41 kilometers of iron and will and human engineering, a single voice answered. It was a woman's voice, unhurried, almost warm. This is Captain Yara Osai of the UES Marathon, Titan-class deep engagement vessel, United Earth Navy. Welcome to Verath 7, Commander. We've been expecting someone to come and take a look. She paused. I've put some coffee on. This might take a while. Relkaz stared at the comm panel. Around him, his officers exchanged glances, the universal expression, across every species, of people who suspect they have badly miscalculated something. Suan, at the back of the bridge, added a single line to her notes. They were not afraid, not even slightly. Admiral Voss Herrick did not believe in hesitation. He had built his reputation, and the Dominari fleet's fearsome name across 6 galactic conflicts, on one simple principle: decisive force applied early wins everything. He had watched Relkaz's initial contact footage 3 times in his private command suite aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion, and each time he watched it, the cold knot in his chest tightened slightly. Not from fear. Voss HFY did not permit fear. From something he might, in a more honest moment, have called recognition. He had seen creatures like this before. Not the ship, nothing like the ship, but the posture. The particular stillness of something that doesn't move because it doesn't need to. He had seen it once in a prey beast on his homeworld, a creature called the Grath, enormous, slow-looking, utterly unbothered by the hunting party surrounding it. They had lost 6 soldiers that day before the beast finally, almost regretfully, walked away. He pushed the memory aside and ordered his fleet to combat formation. 400 ships arranged themselves around the Marathon in a sphere of steel and firepower. It was, by any objective measure, the most overwhelming show of force the Dominari Empire had ever assembled against a single target. Capital ships, destroyer screens, siege platforms designed to reduce planetary surfaces to glass. All of it, every gun, every torpedo, every lance and beam and kinetic rail, aimed at one vessel that had still not moved. Voss HFY opened a fleet-wide channel. All units confirm weapons hot. 400 confirmations came back in under 10 seconds. He straightened his admiral's coat, a gesture he had performed before every engagement of his career, and keyed the direct channel to the Marathon. Human vessel. His voice was the voice of an empire, deep, measured, absolute. You are surrounded and outgunned by a ratio we consider generous to compute. You will power down all systems, extend docking umbilicals, and prepare to receive a Dominari boarding party. You have 90 seconds to comply before we reduce your vessel to component atoms. This is not a negotiation. The channel was open. The entire fleet was listening. Silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20, 40. Then Captain Osai's voice returned. And the thing that bothered Voss HFY most, the thing he would think about for years afterward, was that she sounded precisely the same as she had in the first transmission. No tension. No urgency. Not the performed calm of someone hiding fear, but the genuine, settled ease of someone who had assessed the situation and found nothing in it to worry about. Admiral Voss HFY, she said, and she pronounced his name perfectly, which meant she had done her research. I've read your service record. 29 engagements, 29 victories. That's genuinely impressive, and I mean that without sarcasm. So I'm going to do you a courtesy that I don't extend to everyone. A brief pause, the sound of something ceramic being set down, a cup perhaps. You have 60 seconds to reverse course and withdraw your fleet to a distance of 10,000 kilometers. After that, the courtesy expires. Voss HFY stared at the comm panel. Around him, his bridge officers were very still. Then from somewhere to his left, a junior weapons officer let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh. It broke the tension like a stone through glass, and within seconds the entire bridge was doing it. Officers chuckling, shaking heads, exchanging the particular look of professionals who have encountered something so absurd they cannot help but find it funny. Voss HFY did not laugh, but he allowed himself a thin smile. Open fire, he said. All batteries, full saturation. What happened next would later be described, by those who survived it, as the most beautiful and most terrible thing they had ever witnessed. 400 ships fired simultaneously. The space between the fleet and the Marathon became a solid thing, a wall of light and energy and superheated plasma so dense that sensors briefly lost the ability to distinguish individual weapon signatures. Torpedoes by the thousand, antimatter lances, mass driver slugs traveling at fractional light speed. The combined output of an empire's finest weapons, compressed into a single, sustained, overwhelming volley directed at one target. The Marathon sat in the center of it and took it. For 6 seconds, Voss HFY counted, The great ship was invisible, swallowed by the firestorm. Every impact indicator on every console across the fleet screamed positive hits. The energy readings were extraordinary. By every calculation his tactical systems could perform, nothing in the known galaxy could survive that volume of fire. Then the energy readings began to drop. Not because the firing had stopped, they were still firing, but because the Marathon's hull was absorbing it, bleeding it, dispersing it across a surface so vast and so layered that the energy had nowhere to concentrate, nothing to pierce, nothing to exploit. When the smoke cleared, when the sensors recalibrated and the viewscreen stabilized, the Marathon was still there. Its hull was warmer. There were scorch marks along its forward sections that hadn't been there before. One of its secondary antenna arrays had been sheared away, and a long gouge had been carved into its port flank, exposing something beneath the outer armor that glowed a dull, angry red. It had sustained damage, cosmetic, minor, infuriating damage. And then, slowly, with the vast, unhurried dignity of a continent rearranging itself, the Marathon turned around. Not to flee. Its engines weren't even at half power. It turned the way you turn when you've been sitting with your back to something and have decided, finally, to face it properly. Its main forward batteries rotated into position. Systems that had been dark and cold began to illuminate on the Dominari sensor feeds, weapons signatures unlike anything in their database, energy readings climbing past every scale their instruments were calibrated for. Vasechorariaka's thin smile was gone. Relkaz, listening from his own bridge, found that he had gripped the arms of his command chair hard enough that the material had cracked. Suan wrote one line. They turned around, not away, toward. In the hours that followed the first exchange, before the Marathon responded with its own weapons, something extraordinary happened aboard the Dominari fleet. The engineers started talking. It began with a single transmission, from Chief Engineer Pockvel aboard the destroyer Steadfast Claw, sent on the technical frequency that fleet engineers used for maintenance chatter. It was not meant to be fleet-wide. It was not meant to be recorded. It was an engineer talking to other engineers, the way engineers do when they encounter something that breaks their understanding of the world. I've been running the impact absorption numbers for the last 20 minutes, Pockvel transmitted, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone doing math they don't trust. Our full volley, all 400 ships, delivered approximately 4.7 exajoules of energy to that hull in 6 seconds. For reference, that's roughly twice the energy released by our largest planetary bombardment on Keth 4. The hull temperature on the Marathon rose by 41 degrees. 41 degrees. I need someone to tell me I'm wrong, please. Someone tell me I'm wrong. Nobody told her she was wrong. Within 10 minutes, every technical channel in the fleet was alive with engineers, physicists, and weapons analysts comparing their sensor readings, running their own calculations, and arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. The Marathon's armor was not a conventional system. It was not reactive plating, electromagnetic shielding, or any variant of the dispersal technology known to the conquered. It was something else, something layered so deeply and engineered so carefully that it appeared to function as a kind of conversation between materials, each layer speaking to the next about the energy it received and collectively deciding what to do with it. Suan, who had quietly patched herself into the technical channel from her station on Relkaz's bridge, listened to all of it and began writing rapidly. She was not an engineer. She was a diplomat and a scholar of civilizational behavior, and what she was hearing was not to her a technical puzzle. It was a story. She had spent 40 years studying how species expressed their values through their technology. What a civilization chose to build first, she had always argued, told you everything about what they were afraid of and what they believed in. The Dominari had built their weapons first. Faster, she thought, brighter, more devastating, more visible. Their weapons were their signature, their identity, their answer to the question of how they wished to be known in the galaxy. The humans, it appeared, had built their armor first. She wrote, consider what this means. Before they built the guns, before they solved for offense, they solved for survival. Every centimeter of that hull is the physical expression of a species that decided at some foundational level that the first thing worth engineering is the ability to endure, to absorb, to remain. She paused, then added, they did not build the armor to protect the ship. They built the ship to carry the armor. The architecture is inverted. The armor is the vessel. Everything else exists inside it. The analysis was confirmed, in purely technical language, by the fleet's own analysts. The Marathon's outer hull was a composite of 17 distinct material layers, each performing a different function. The outermost, a dark, slightly textured surface that had given the ship its iron appearance, was a kinetic redistributor, a material of almost unimaginable density that converted physical impacts into lateral force and spread it across the hull's surface area. Beneath it was an electromagnetic dampening mesh that absorbed directed energy weapons and bled their charge into a network of superconducting channels that ran the full length of the ship. Beneath that was a self-repairing ablative layer, a material seeded with repair nanites that immediately began reconstructing damaged sections. Then another kinetic layer. Then another dampening mesh. Then a thermal dissipation system. Then structural foam, smart-bonded and self-tensioning, designed to maintain hull integrity even under stresses that would collapse the frame of any other ship in known space. 17 layers, kilometers thick in the most critical sections. And beneath all of it, protected by everything above as though by a fortress inside another fortress, was the crew. The 43,000 human beings who lived and worked inside the Marathon, separated from the void and from the guns of 400 enemy warships by more armor than most species put in their entire planetary defense grids. Pockvel sent one final transmission on the technical channel before it was shut down by Fleet Command, who had realized, too late, how demoralizing the conversation had become. "I just want to note," she said quietly, "that the gouge our full planetary bombardment equivalent volley carved into that hull. Based on the depth readings we got through Layer 2, we didn't touch Layer 3. On Relkaz's bridge, a weapons officer named Chorek had been listening. He was young, his first major fleet deployment, and he had joined the Dominari military with the genuine, uncomplicated belief that the Dominari were the most powerful force in the galaxy. He had believed this completely, the way young soldiers believe things, without examination or doubt. He sat at his console now, staring at the sensor readings, and felt that belief dissolving in real time. Not replaced by despair, something more complicated than despair. Something closer to the particular dizziness you feel when a room you've lived in all your life suddenly reveals a door you never knew was there. "Commander," he said, his voice carefully flat, "how long have humans been building ships?" Relkaz had been asking himself the same question. "Long enough," he said. Suan heard the exchange. She wrote the last line of her third entry. "The armor is not the most frightening thing. The most frightening thing is that they built it before they knew they would need it. They built it against an enemy they hadn't met yet. Against us, in other words, before we existed to them. They planned for us before they knew our names." 22 minutes had passed since the Dominari's opening volley. 22 minutes of the Marathon sitting in the center of a 400-ship formation, having absorbed the full force of the most devastating salvo in Dominari military history, doing precisely nothing. No return fire, no evasive maneuver, no further communication. Admiral Vas HRR had used the time to do three things. He had ordered a full tactical reassessment. He had overridden the engineering channel that had been quietly destroying morale across his fleet. And he had, in the privacy of his command suite with the door sealed, stared at the sensor readout of the Marathon for a very long time and permitted himself to feel something he had not felt since he was a child. He was not sure what to call it. It sat in his chest like a stone. He sealed the feeling away, opened the door, and returned to his bridge. "Second volley," he ordered. "Concentrated on the forward section. All torpedo tubes, sequential fire, timed to impact simultaneously. Let's see how much of that hull is actually homogeneous." His weapons teams responded with professional efficiency. They were Dominari, they did not stop, they adapted. The second volley was smaller but smarter, tightly focused, staggered for maximum penetration effect. It struck the Marathon's bow in a pattern designed to overwhelm the lateral redistribution of the outer armor, hitting them from 17 slightly different angles in the 10th of a second. The outer hull cracked, briefly, visibly. A fracture line appeared on their sensors, running perhaps 200 meters before the self-repair system sealed it. The crew of Dominion held their breath. Then on the sensor display across the fleet, a new set of readings appeared. Not from Marathon's engines, not from the system they had been entering. From something deep inside the ship had been entirely dark. His voice on Elkaz's bridge had gone very quiet. Marathon is activating something. Flank section. I don't recognize the configuration. Energy reading. Commander, the energy single array on that ship exceed our entire fleets without combined. A one battery, however many Marathon carried along its 41-kilometer length. Nobody said anything. The array rotated, slowly, precisely, with the deliberateness of something that has all the time in the world because it has never needed to hurry. It found its targets, and here was the thing that Relkaz would replay in his mind for years, the thing that separated this engagement from every other battle he had ever witnessed. The targeting was not scattershot. It was not the saturation fire of a force trying to inflict maximum damage. It was the careful, point-specific selection of a force that knew exactly what it was doing and was choosing, very deliberately, to do something less than what it could. The array fired 4 times. The first shot took the steadfast Claw, the destroyer from which Engineer Pockvel had sent her transmissions, and removed its engine block with surgical exactness. The Claw tumbled, losing power, its crew alive, its hull intact, its weapons destroyed. The second shot hit the siege platform, Divine Reckoning, at the precise junction between its main gun assembly and its power core. The gun went dark, the ship kept power, the crew was fine. The third and fourth shots took 2 Dominari capital ships simultaneously, their sensor arrays, their weapons, their drives, leaving both vessels as inert hulks drifting harmlessly in formation. 4 shots, 4 ships neutralized, 0 casualties. The engagement lasted less than 8 seconds. Then the Marathon went quiet again. Voss Herrick stood on his bridge, watching the readouts, and understood with the sudden, terrible clarity of a very experienced military mind what had just happened. The Marathon hadn't attacked. It had answered a question. His fleet had asked, "What are you capable of?" And the Marathon had shown them the lowest end of the range. It had used 1 battery. It had fired 4 times. It had chosen its targets with such precision that he now knew with absolute certainty that if it had chosen differently, if it had aimed slightly differently, hit slightly differently, 4 ships would not be drifting. They would be debris. It was not demonstrating power. It was demonstrating control, which was infinitely worse because control implied choice, and choice implied that everything that had happened so far had been permitted. The Dominari fleet had not been fighting the Marathon. They had been visiting it, and the Marathon had been deciding, moment by moment, how much of itself to reveal. Chorak, the young weapons officer on Relkaz's bridge, looked at his commander. "It's hurting us," he said. His voice was very young. "Sir, it's not fighting us, it's hurting us." Relkaz said nothing. Suan was writing again. Fast now, with urgency, because she could feel the shape of something enormous, and she wanted to catch it before it slipped away. The guns did not wake up in anger. This is crucial, the guns did not wake up in anger. They woke up the way a person wakes up when something has finally demanded their attention. There is a difference between a weapon of war and a weapon of correction. What I witnessed today was the latter. 4 shots, 0 deaths, maximum message. The Marathon does not want to destroy this fleet. It wants to educate it. She paused, then wrote 1 final line for that entry. "I am becoming certain that the most dangerous thing about this ship is not its guns or its armor. It is its patience." Relkaz made the call himself. He did not consult Voss HFY. He did not request permission through the chain of command. He simply looked at the tactical display, at the 4 drifting hulks, at the remaining 396 ships of the war host, at the Marathon sitting in the center of them, all like a mountain that had grown bored of waiting, and he keyed the direct channel. "Marathon," he said, "this is Commander Relkaz. I am requesting a direct communication with your commanding officer, not a demand, a request." The response came in under 3 seconds. "Commander Relkaz." Captain Osai's voice was the same as it had been in the first transmission, calm, present, unhurried. "I've been hopping, you'd call, go ahead." He had prepared questions. Tactical questions, diplomatic questions, the careful language of an officer trying to extract information while revealing as little as possible. He opened his mouth to deliver the first of them and found that what came out instead was something much more honest. "What are you?" A brief pause, not hesitation, consideration. "A deep engagement vessel, Titan class. The Marathon is the 3rd of her kind completed and commissioned by the United Earth Navy." Another pause. "She's also currently the most decorated ship in the fleet, if that's relevant." "3rd of her kind," Relkaz repeated. "How many exist?" "Currently commissioned? 7. 2 more are under construction at the series yards. The program anticipates 14 total first wave." The bridge was absolutely silent. Relkaz was aware in a distant way that every officer present was doing the same arithmetic he was. One ship had absorbed their full planetary bombardment equivalent volley and answered with 1 battery and 4 shots. 7 of these ships existed. 14 were planned. Why? He asked, and he meant it as a tactical question, but it came out as something closer to philosophical. That's a good question, Osa said, and she sounded like she meant it. The short answer is that Earth spent several hundred years being afraid. Of ourselves mostly, we're very good at fighting each other, which I say without any pride. Then we got out into space and discovered we weren't alone, and the fear got redirected. We spent a long time wondering if something out here was going to come for us. A pause. So we built the thing that would make us stop being afraid. Titan class. The answer to the question of what happens if someone comes for Earth. And if no one came. Then we'd have 7 very large ships and nothing to use them for, which honestly would have been ideal. Her tone was dry but not unkind. Commander, can I ask you something? He was startled. You may. Why did you fire first? I gave you 60 seconds. You had options. Relkaz considered lying. He was very good at it. He looked at the 4 drifting ships on his tactical display and decided, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, that dishonesty felt wrong here. Like bringing a knife to a conversation with someone who could dissolve knives. Because you didn't seem afraid, he said. And in my experience, something that doesn't seem afraid of the Dominari warhost is either very stupid or very dangerous. We needed to know which. And now you know. And now we know. For what it's worth, Osai said, the 60 seconds was genuine. I would have preferred you to take it. The 4 ships we disabled, their crews are fine. We'll render assistance if you want to send recovery vessels. And I want to be clear that this engagement, as far as the marathon is concerned, is over. We're not interested in pushing further. At the back of the bridge, Suan had set down her recorder. She was listening now with no filter, no analytical layer, just listening. The way she'd listened when she was a child, and the world still had the capacity to genuinely surprise her. She had spent 40 years studying civilizations. She had met species that communicated through pheromone cascades and species that experienced time nonlinearly, and species so ancient that their language had become purely mathematical. She thought she had developed a reasonable immunity to being astonished. Captain Osai's voice, steady, human, utterly without malice, was dismantling that immunity in real time. Captain, Relkaz said carefully, you said the marathon is the answer to what happens if someone comes for Earth, but no one has come for Earth. Not yet, Osai said. But you built this anyway. We built 7 of them, and we're building 7 more. A pause. Commander, humanity has a saying, an old one from before we even had the concept of space travel. If you want peace, prepare for war. We took that seriously, very seriously. Possibly, and I acknowledge this as a legitimate criticism, more seriously than was strictly necessary. Relkaz thought about the 17 layers of armor. He thought about the surgical precision of 4 shots from 1 battery. He thought about the 43,000 people living inside this ship, going about their lives in corridors and crew quarters, and probably cafeterias and engineering bays, all of it wrapped in more armor than his civilization had produced in its entire military history. Your people, he said slowly, have been planning for this conversation for a very long time. For about 300 years, give or take, Osai said. We just weren't sure who we'd be having it with. Suan picked up her recorder. She wrote, she said it without threat and without apology. 300 years of preparation for a war that hadn't started against an enemy they hadn't named. And the result was a vessel that, in its first engagement, disabled 4 ships without killing anyone and then offered to help with repairs. I am beginning to understand that I have been studying civilizations wrong. I have been asking what a civilization fears. I should have been asking what it loves enough to protect this carefully. Admiral Vas HFY listened to the recording of Relkaz's conversation with Captain Os 4 times. Then he called his senior staff to his command suite, sealed the door, and laid out a decision that he had made before any of them entered the room. He was that kind of man. The Sorrow Lance, he said. The room went very still. The Sorrow Lance was the Dominari's most classified weapon, so classified that even most of the officers in that room had known it only as a rumor until now. It had been installed aboard the Eternal Dominion 6 years ago, tested twice in deep space with no witnesses, and kept dark and cold in the heart of the flagship ever since, reserved for a situation so extreme that its use had never been seriously contemplated. It was a focused antimatter beam, not a burst, a sustained, accelerating stream of antimatter particles directed through a magnetic lens so precisely calibrated that its effective point of impact was less than 3 meters in diameter. In 43 recorded tests against target vessels and planetary installations, it had never failed to destroy its target. In many cases, it had not merely destroyed but erased, leaving nothing but dispersed energy and the memory of something that had existed. Vos HRYKIS weapons chief, a heavyset Dominari veteran named Groth, spoke first. "Sir, if we fire the lance and it doesn't work." "It will work," Vos HRYKIS said. He believed it, which made what followed worse. The fleet was ordered to open a corridor, a clear firing lane from the Eternal Dominion to the Marathon. 396 ships repositioned. On the Marathon's bridge, they could not have missed the maneuver. They said nothing. They didn't move. The Sorrow Lance took 11 minutes to charge. Vos Herrick spent them standing at his viewport, watching the Marathon, thinking about the conversation Relkaz had transmitted. 300 years of preparation. He thought about that. He tried to make it fit into a shape he recognized and found that it didn't. The Dominari prepared for wars they knew were coming. They identified enemies, assessed threats, built weapons scaled to specific opponents. Preparation without a named enemy was a concept he didn't have a word for. "Lance at full charge," Groth reported. "Ready to fire on your order." Vos HRYK looked at the Marathon one more time. He thought, they will have seen us charging this. They have sensors we can barely comprehend. They know something is coming. He thought, they still haven't moved. "Fire," he said. The Sorrow Lance fired. It was, in the technical literature, described as a beam. In practice, it looked like a tear, a rupture in space itself, a line of absolute darkness framed by the collapse of light around it, moving at speeds that made the concept of observation almost meaningless. It crossed the distance from the Eternal Dominion to the Marathon in less than a second and struck the human vessel dead center, precisely between its midpoint and forward third. And the Marathon shuddered. It was the first time the great ship had moved under outside force, a visible physical shudder that traveled in a wave from the impact point toward both ends, a vibration that their sensors measured, and their eyes confirmed, and their hearts, in some ancient way that preceded language, registered as significance. Then the Marathon went dark. Every light, running lights, weapons indicators, drive emissions, everything extinguished simultaneously. The sensor readings dropped. The energy signature collapsed. The ship that had seemed up to this moment as permanent as geography simply stopped. Silence on every bridge in the fleet. And then from somewhere in the darkness behind Vos Herrick, a sound began. Low, collective, rising, his crew, cheering. 30 years of trained, iron-disciplined officers and crew breaking formation in a wave of released tension, fists raised, voices lifted, the sound of a fleet that had been afraid and was now briefly not. Vos Herrick let them. He stood at his viewport and watched the dark shape of the Marathon and waited. He waited because he had lived long enough to know that the moment everyone starts cheering is often the moment you should be most afraid. He waited 18 seconds. Then the Marathon's lights came back on. All of them, every running light, every weapons indicator, every sensor emitter, every operational system, all at once, in a single blaze of illumination that lit the surrounding space like a second sun rising. The energy readings on every console in the fleet spiked past their maximum calibration and kept climbing. Systems that had been dormant for the entire engagement began spinning up secondary drives, weapons arrays, point defense networks, systems they had no classification for all of it, all at once, with the sudden and total presence of something that had been holding back and had now decided for the first time to simply be what it was. And through every open comms channel across the Dominari fleet, Captain Osai's voice returned. It was still calm, it was still unhurried. But there was something in it now, a quality Relkaz would later describe, inadequately, as texture. The difference between still water and deep water. "That," she said, "actually left a mark. Your targeting was excellent. I want to acknowledge that." A pause. "Now I'm paying attention." What followed lasted 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Relkaz knew the exact duration because he checked the timestamp on his bridge recorder afterward, needing the number the way you need a solid surface when the ground has started moving. 11 minutes and 23 seconds. He had lived through battles that lasted days and left him feeling nothing as profound as those 11 minutes. The Marathon did not accelerate to attack speed. It did not charge. It simply began to move through the Dominari fleet the way a tide moves through a harbor, inevitable, unhurried, indifferent to the urgency of anything in its path. Its point defense systems activated first, and the result was immediate. Every torpedo in the air detonated before reaching its target. Not a few, every one. Hundreds of projectiles, fired by scores of desperate ships, simply ceased to exist at varying distances from the Marathon's hull, picked out of space with a precision that shouldn't have been possible at those velocities. The beam weapons were handled differently, absorbed by the same armor systems they had already learned were impenetrable, or deflected by electromagnetic fields that bent the beams harmlessly aside like light through a prism. Then the Marathon's secondary batteries opened up, and that was when Relkaz understood, completely and finally, the distinction between what the ship had shown them before and what it was showing them now. Before, it had used one array and fired 4 times. Now it used 12 arrays, and it was methodical in a way that transcended the word. Each shot was placed with a specificity that required, he later calculated with his analysts, targeting solutions that accounted for the movement of the target vessel, the movement of every other vessel in the fleet, the drift of disabled ships, and the debris field of the earlier engagement, simultaneously, continuously, across all 12 firing arrays, updating in real time as the tactical picture changed. A drive section here, a weapons cluster there, a power relay severed on one ship, a sensor array taken off another. Ship after ship went dark in sequence, coasting to a halt, their crews intact and their hulls whole, and their ability to threaten anything in this star system permanently removed for the foreseeable future. Relkaz's own ship, the scout vessel Persistent Dawn, was taken out of the engagement in the 4th minute. A single shot to his engine manifold, clean enough that the structural integrity of the hull was uncompromised. The lights stayed on. Life support was fine. His crew was fine. He simply had no engines and no weapons and was now, for all practical purposes, a very expensive piece of furniture floating in someone else's combat. He went to his viewport. He watched the Marathon move through his fleet. He had commanded warships for 30 years. He had developed, over those decades, a professional appreciation for good military tactics, the elegance of a well-executed pincer, the economy of a perfect retreat, the geometry of a defensive formation holding under pressure. He appreciated these things the way a craftsman appreciates another craftsman's work. What he was watching now was beyond that. It was beyond tactics, beyond strategy, beyond the vocabulary of war as he understood it. The Marathon was not fighting the Dominari fleet. It was solving it, the way you solve a puzzle, patiently, completely, leaving no unsatisfied piece. Every ship it addressed was left intact. Every crew was left alive. Every engagement was concluded, with the minimum force required to achieve the specific, surgical objective of rendering that ship no longer a threat. 0 casualties, after everything, after the Sorrow Lance, after the saturation volleys, after everything the Dominari warhost had thrown at one vessel for the better part of an hour, 0 casualties. Suan was at her own viewport on her own now powerless ship. She had stopped writing. Her recorder was in her hand, but she wasn't using it. She was just watching, and the watching felt necessary, felt like something that had to be witnessed fully without the mediation of language. She thought about something her first diplomatic mentor had told her many years ago. The truest measure of a civilization is not what it does to enemies who can't fight back. It's what it does to enemies who can. The Marathon could have ended this fleet inside of 2 minutes. She knew that now with a certainty that needed no calculation. It had chosen not to. It had chosen to spend 11 minutes being careful, being thorough and precise and measured, to guarantee an outcome in which no one died. Not from mercy exactly, though mercy was part of it. From something more structural than mercy. From a philosophy embedded so deeply in the ship's design, and the crew's training that it wasn't a decision that needed to be made in the moment. It had been decided long ago, in the slow years of its construction, in the doctrine written around Titan-class vessels, in the values of the people who built them. The Marathon reached the far edge of the fleet formation, the position where Voss Herrick's flagship Eternal Dominion floated, its lance depleted, its weapons stripped, its admiral standing at a viewport that Suan couldn't see but could somehow perfectly imagine. It paused there, just for a moment. Then it stopped. 396 ships, disabled, adrift, alive. The Marathon held position and opened a general channel. This is Captain Osai. The engagement is concluded. We are prepared to assist with emergency repairs and medical support for any vessel requiring it. Please transmit your needs on this channel and we will respond. That's an open offer with no conditions attached. A pause. Take your time, we're not going anywhere. Relkaz turned away from his viewport. His bridge crew was very still, not the stillness of shock exactly, but the stillness of people who have just had their understanding of the universe fundamentally revised and haven't yet figured out how to move inside the new version. Chorak, the young weapons officer, was staring at his console. We should have run, he said quietly, at the beginning when she gave us 60 seconds. Yes, Relkaz said. Why didn't we? Relkaz looked at his viewport, at the massive shape of the Marathon holding station at the edge of where his fleet used to be. Because we didn't believe her, he said. Because nothing we had ever encountered prepared us to believe her. Chorak nodded slowly. Then, do you think they knew that we wouldn't believe her? Relkaz considered it. Yes, he said, I think they planned for it. Suan, in her own quiet cabin aboard her own quiet ship, finally raised her recorder and wrote the entry for Part 7 in a single long sentence that she didn't stop to edit. She offered help. After all of it, after the lance, after the saturation volleys, after an hour of the Dominari fleet throwing everything it had at her ship, the first thing Captain Os said when it was over was to offer help. And she said it without satisfaction, without theater, without even the small human pleasure of being the one who won. And I think that is the most frightening and the most beautiful thing I have ever encountered in 40 years of studying what civilizations do to each other. Galactic Concord convened an emergency session 14 days after the Verath 7 engagement. The delay was not bureaucratic. Convening the Concord, 47 species, 112 member worlds, the accumulated political architecture of 2,000 years of interstellar diplomacy, required physical travel for most delegations, and many of them had spent the 14 days doing exactly what the Dominari engineers had done in the minutes after the first volley. Running the numbers, pulling the sensor data, trying to build a mental model of what they had seen that didn't immediately collapse under its own implications. The session was called in the Grand Chamber of Concord Station, a space designed to accommodate the physical and atmospheric requirements of every member species simultaneously, a feat of engineering that the station's builders had been rightly proud of. It was a vast, circular room with tiered seating, its ceiling high enough to allow the aerial members to participate comfortably, its floor divided into atmospheric zones separated by permeable membranes. It held, on a normal session day, the particular organized noise of many minds working on many problems. On this day, it was very quiet. The footage of the Verath 7 engagement had been transmitted to every member world within 48 hours of the battle. Suan had seen to that personally, transmitting her own documentation alongside the official Dominari sensor records. Every delegate in the chamber had seen it. Most had seen it more than once. Several had, according to their aides, watched it on continuous loop during the transit to Concord Station, searching for something in the footage that would make it make sense. What they had found, uniformly, was that it made complete sense. That was the problem. It made a kind of sense that reorganized everything around it. The session opened with a procedural address from the Concord chair. An ancient, patient Velhari named Us who had held the position for 20 years and had developed, over those 2 decades, an extraordinary immunity to surprise. He read the opening formalities in his usual measured cadence and then looked out at the assembled delegates and said, simply, "The floor is open." Silence. Not the silence of people waiting for someone else to go first. The silence of 47 species, staring at a document on the center table that had not been there at the previous session. It was a single folder, bound in a material that none of them recognized, smooth, dark, slightly warm to the touch, as the delegates nearest to it had discovered when they arrived. The human diplomatic attaché, a young woman named Priya Vasquez who had been assigned to the Concord mission for 3 years and had, in those 3 years, been largely unremarkable, had placed it on the table when the chamber opened, and then taken her seat without explanation or ceremony. Chair Us looked at the folder. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, "would you like to speak to the document?" Priya Vasquez stood. She was small by most of the chamber's standards, smaller than the Dominari delegates, smaller than the hulking Vreth contingent, smaller than half a dozen other species in the room. She had the particular quality that Suan, watching from the diplomatic observation gallery, recognized as characteristic of everyone she had encountered from humanity's institutional class: a total absence of performance. She was not nervous. She was not triumphant. She was simply present, the way people are when they have nothing to prove. 40 years ago, Vasquez said, without preamble. The United Earth government drafted a proposal for a mutual defense agreement to be extended to every member of the Galactic Concord. The terms are straightforward. In exchange for access to Concord trade networks and a seat at Concord sessions, Earth commits to the defense of any member world that requests it, against any external threat, using whatever assets are required. She paused. We filed the proposal with the Concord Secretariat 3 years ago. It has been sitting in the queue for review. She looked at the folder on the table. That is a physical copy of the proposal in each member species' primary language. We printed it because we thought a physical document might be easier to take seriously than a filing in a queue. Silence again. The Dominari delegation's lead ambassador, not Voss Herrick, not Relkaz, neither of whom were diplomats, but a senior figure named Dawes who had the weathered look of someone who had been doing this for a very long time, leaned forward slowly. You are offering, he said carefully, to defend conquered member worlds with vessels like the Marathon. Among other assets, yes. In exchange for a trade agreement. And a seat at the table. The trade agreement matters to us economically. The seat matters to us philosophically. We'd like to be part of what's being built out here. Dawes stared at the folder. You drafted this 40 years ago. The first draft, yes. It's been revised several times. The most recent version is what's in the folder. Before the Marathon was built. The Marathon was commissioned 23 years ago, so yes, before the Marathon. The policy preceded the ship. Dawes sat back. He looked at his hands for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something fundamental. You built the ships, he said slowly, to make the offer credible, not the other way around. Vasquez looked at him steadily. We built the ships because we believe that if you're going to make a promise, you should be able to keep it. The chamber was quiet for a long time. Suan in the observation gallery had her recorder in her hand. She had been writing notes throughout, a habit of 40 years that she couldn't have stopped if she tried. But she paused now, her stylus hovering over the surface, and looked down at the chamber below. 47 species, 112 worlds, 2,000 years of interstellar civilization, of war and treaty and trade and discovery, of the slow, grinding work of learning to share a galaxy. All of them sitting in silence around a folder on a table, looking at it with the expression of people who have just been handed something they didn't know they were waiting for. A Velhari delegate to Suan's left murmured, almost to herself, They've been carrying this the whole time. Suan wrote her final entry. The Concord adopted the Mutual Defense Agreement by unanimous vote, which had not happened in 11 years. The process took 4 hours. Most of the time was spent not on negotiating terms. The terms, as Ambassador Vasquez had noted, were straightforward, but on the delegates asking questions. Not tactical questions, not political questions. The questions they asked were the kind you ask when you are trying to understand a thing from the inside. Why did you build them this way? What does it mean to you? What were you afraid of? What do you hope for? Captain Osai was patched in via long-range communication for part of the session, from the bridge of the Marathon, which was still at Verath 7, assisting with repairs to the Dominari fleet. She answered every question with the same quality I had first noticed in her transmissions. The particular honesty of someone who has thought about something for a very long time and arrived at answers they believe in. After the vote, the chamber was quiet again. Not the stunned silence of the beginning, something different. The specific quiet of a room in which something important has been decided and everyone present knows it. Chair Us looked at Ambassador Vasquez and said simply, Welcome to the table. Vasquez nodded. Then she said with the faintest possible edge of dry humor, We've been standing outside for 40 years. It's good to sit down. I have spent my career documenting first contacts, diplomatic breakthroughs, civilizational turning points. I have written hundreds of thousands of words about the moments when histories change direction. I know with the confidence of a person who has seen many such moments that this was one of them. Not because of the ships, though the ships are extraordinary. Not because of the battle, though the battle will be studied for generations. Because of the folder on the table. Because of the 40 years of preparation. Because of the 60 seconds they offered before opening fire and the medical assistance they offered after, and the fact that both of those things, the warning and the mercy, came from exactly the same place in exactly the same philosophy. Humanity arrived at the Galactic Concord the way the Marathon arrived at Verath 7, already decided, already prepared, already certain at some foundational level of what they were for and what they were willing to do and what they would never do. waiting with enormous patience for the rest of us to be ready for the conversation. They were not speechless, we were. We were speechless. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. And